Welcome to today's episode, The Future of Work in Manufacturing, part of our Industry 4 Ready podcast series. I'm your host, Nick Davis, Industry 4 leader for Deloitte here in the UK. Today we'll explore the people dimension of smart manufacturing. Manufacturers are increasingly focused on the work being performed, how the workforce will be aligned to that work, and even where work takes place to fully realise the potential of digital technologies and practices emerging in the fourth industrial revolution. Today, we'll explore some of these topics and what manufacturers need to consider as they plan for the future in both the long term and the near term. To share their views on the future of work, workforce, and workplace in manufacturing, I am really pleased to be joined by Jan Godsell, Professor of Operations and Supply Chain Strategy at the Warwick Manufacturing Group, and Bruce Finch, Industrial's Human Capital Expert here at Deloitte. Perhaps we could start with a few introductions. Jan, it's great to see you again, and thank you for joining as a guest. For those who haven't had a chance to listen to your debut on episode 2 of our series, please tell us a little bit about yourself.
As you said, I work at WMG and I head up our supply chain research group. But really, what my work focuses on is really about working with organisations to explore that relationship between productivity, resilience and sustainability. But increasingly, what we have to think about is the future, and that both the future of manufacturing and that of work is going to be very, very different. And when you think that actually both age expectancy or life expectancy and productivity in the UK have both stagnated, that going forward to solve this productivity puzzle, we really need to think about the two together. So it's great to be with you.
Thank you, Jan. And Bruce, great to have you with us today. Please tell us a little bit about yourself and why you're interested in the role that Industry 4 will have on the future of work.
Hello, Nick. It's my pleasure to be joining you and Jan today. So just a little bit about myself. I've been in Deloitte for 10 years in the energy, resources and industrial sector, working in mining, metals, oil and gas and manufacturing. And I'm focusing on transformations and the future of work, and how we can bring technology in to improve productivity within our clients, looking at every type of technology, whether it's in the workplace or artificial intelligence, robotics, bringing together every lever that we can to improve the future of work and the future of output for our clients.
Thanks, Bruce. And I guess just to start off and to kick off with a little bit of a definition, really, Bruce, what do we mean by the future of work?
So here in Deloitte, we've been looking at the future of work very much through the lens of our Human Capital Trends survey of 6,000 European executives every year since 2011. And we look at it in 3 dimensions. The first is work. What is work? And what we mean by that is, what is the balance between the parts of work which are performed by humans in the workplace and that's completed by automation and artificial intelligence? The second is workforce. What is the composition of the workforce at work? And how can we broaden the workforce talent pool by using alternative talent models beyond the traditional employment model? And finally, the workplace. And that's become ever more into sharp relief because of the COVID crisis. And workplace is the physical and virtual combination of where work is done and how we go to maximize productivity and consistency of output in the places where that work is done.
Okay, thank you, Bruce. And Jan, I think many of those principles apply across industries, but what would they mean specifically for manufacturers?
If you think about manufacturing, it's a broad topic, and one of the critical drivers within manufacturing at the moment is the driver around net zero. We did a study last year looking at the link between sort of practices around circular economy, sustainability, and supply chain and manufacturing networks. We started with over 600,000 different sources and whittled that down through what we call a systematic review into the top 108. Now, you'll be very pleased to know that Deloitte actually comprised 8 of those publications. You're second only to a more general set of EU publications. But when you looked within those 108 sources in more detail, what we then identified was 53 factors, which we used to develop some scenarios for the future. And when we start looking at what the future manufacturing landscape may look like in 2035, it's quite different. Lots of people ask at the moment whether or not COVID or Brexit are going to drive us to a perhaps a drive towards reshoring, what's going to drive us to a more flourishing world by 2035 is actually embracing the principles of the circular economy. And in turn, what that's going to lead to is a very different manufacturing network design or footprint to what we currently have, because what we're likely to see is a much greater competition between regions who are competing on sustainability and leading to a much higher level of regional reliance, which will create regional manufacturing hubs within and across the UK that will really start to leverage much more closed loop models, so we avoid some of the risks from resource price fluctuations. And the really critical thing about this is that it will lead to different types of jobs. It won't just be the jobs in that forward-facing aspect of manufacturing, but it will be new jobs in things like recycling, reverse logistics, and also in secondary markets such as upgrade, repair, and remanufacturing.
Okay, thanks, Jan. And I can see a significant kind of macro level long-term trend there. Do you think that's different in the near term? What is it that manufacturers are thinking about in terms of the future of work, as we emerge from COVID and slightly closer in terms of time frame?
So I think if you were to think about this in terms of the future of work at the moment, then if you think about the manufacturing sphere, people are perhaps thinking about the impact of digitization, so more linking in with some of the aspects that Bruce was discussing. And I suppose understanding, therefore, the difference in skill sets that you may need from potentially introducing some of those more near-term digital technologies into a more traditional manufacturing landscape. And what we're seeing that potentially can drive either the optimization of individual processes such as manufacturing, logistics, procurement, but also we're seeing the development of more platform-based thinking to actually connect end-to-end supply chains. And this perhaps requires a slightly different skill set in terms of some of those skills around data analytics and decision making.
And so building on what Jan has said, I think a critical element of that is reskilling the workforce to provide that skill set to meet the new technology challenges that Jan outlined. And we see versatility as the hallmark of unlocking that workforce potential. And one of the big lessons of the COVID-19 pandemic is that when given the opportunity to align their passions and interests with the organization's need, workers step up, are fulfilling roles often that managers never realized that they could. And just some evidence for that, our Human Capital Trends survey saw that the question we posed of the ability to adapt, reskill and assume new roles as top ranked elements in the future of work. 42% of people saw building organizational culture and celebrating growth and diversity as critical to empowering their workforces. And 40% of them saw building workforce capability through upskilling, reskilling, mobility as a key lever to enable themselves to exploit technology to the maximum. So implementing those new techniques, those new skills for the workforce is critical to bringing together the future of work and the technology that Jan outlined to deliver value.
I think that's a really good point, Bruce, because we had an event which actually included some young engineers from the WMG Academy for Young Engineers. And it was very interesting to hear their perspectives because they're obviously looking to pursue careers in this sort of space. And I think there's a sort of presumption sometimes that young people are going to have these very dynamic careers where they move from organisation to organisation. I think it's a bit like the sort of financial concept of real option value, in that the youngsters were really keen to be able to develop a skill or capability set that gave them optionality to be able to pursue many different career paths in the future, but potentially they were quite willing to pursue that career within the same organisation if the organisation gave them the opportunity to pivot and to explore different opportunities. So I think sometimes these slightly caricatured images that we have of different generations, when you actually get beneath the surface, they are caricatures and the reality can be a little bit more nuanced.
Thanks, Jan. And so what skills do this younger generation, the new entrants into the manufacturing workforce, need? And I guess at the same time, what is it that the older generation need in terms of digital skills, that highly skilled older workforce as well?
Yeah, so Paul Shakespeare from the High Value Manufacturing Catapult did a brilliant international study of sort of different skill sets required for the future of manufacturing. And one of the most interesting things that came out for me was that actually we've got an erosion of the basic core concepts around manufacturing strategy. And so whilst there are a lot of new skills we need, there's actually a little bit of going back to basics to make sure that everyone has a really, really sound knowledge, I think, both of manufacturing strategy, but I'd also argue perhaps one of the gaps is more around a good knowledge of end-to-end supply chain strategy too. However, there's also a newer blend of skills, which I touched upon before, which is really about the ability to perhaps make data-driven decisions and how you could use data to make those decisions. And interestingly, here we see some organisations that are particularly keen to try out new business models, actually setting up spin-off organisations. And there's one particular organisation that I was talking to that was sort of faced with a bit of a dilemma, because they're saying, look, we have very long established planners who don't necessarily want to be have their future determined by these algorithms. They believe that they as individuals can plan better. And actually, they were almost expressing a preference for younger planners who were more willing to go with the rules-based approaches and the automated systems. And as we reflected upon it, we perhaps realised that in the short term, you just need to think about COVID-19 and the sort of peak in demand that was created by panic buying. There was no system in the world that the first time the system saw that would have known how to react to a peak in demand of that kind. And so actually, perhaps it's not a question of, is it you go fully automated and value those skills over perhaps more experienced planners that may be more reticent. I think what we came to the conclusion that actually in the short term, it's going to be a real blend of skills, and actually it's having the systems in place that system will quite happily flag when it sees perhaps a decision that's beyond its normal decision-making parameters, and actually flag when perhaps a more experienced planner is needed. And so in that way, I think we can see this real blend of skills from those people that may have really valuable experience that could potentially train those algorithms rather than necessarily being replaced by them.
And that leads nicely on to one of our concepts that we're working here at Deloitte, which is the Superteam, making workforce real in the future of work. So we've been talking about the team as the basis for work for the last few years. And our concept of the super team are groups of people and intelligent machines, whether that's AI or automation, working together to solve problems, gain insight, and so create value. And so we see this organizational concept as holding the promise to enable organizations to reinvent themselves and to create new value and meaning in that work, while giving their workers the potential to reinvent their careers and their skills in ways in which increase their value, the workers' value to the organizations, and consequently their own employability. And so we see that as people, machines, and technology working together in a seamless but flexible way. Interestingly enough, our Future of Work Human Capital Trends survey saw 54% of the 6,000 executives we surveyed looking at reimagining work in this way.
Fantastic, thank you, Bruce. It strikes me, Jan, that the last 12 months or so have been obviously an unprecedented business and global environment. I hear around some areas of the future of work have been vastly accelerated. The kind of the remote working in different ways for teams forming and working together, but equally the adoption of digital and some priorities within business has been quite different. What's your kind of view of the kind of the state of the nation around the future of work? What have we learned over the last 12 months, and what opportunities are there to leverage that and address some of the challenges that manufacturers have?
I'm fortunate to be part of the Made Smarter challenge. And interestingly, when you look at, for instance, the adoption of industrial digital technologies, it's not the adoption of the technology in itself that's the goal, it's the outcome that gives in terms of productivity and competitiveness. And actually during the pandemic, what we saw quite successfully happen in the UK is where people were able to repurpose their manufacturing capability to a different purpose. So for instance, the production of PPE or even ventilators. And so what they were showing was this ability to be able to compete through economies of scope, which is a really good capability to have. But actually, where those UK manufacturers potentially pivoted and were able to respond in this way and gain a short-term competitive advantage, interestingly, over time, as China and other sources have come back on board and perhaps have a cost advantage, it's very, very quick for some of those customers that favoured that responsiveness in the short term, that in the longer term, they go back to favouring cost. And so I'm not necessarily sure that we're going to see a future of work that will lead to that 2035 scenario that I previously described happening unless we can genuinely gain a competitive advantage. And I think that's going to come about when we start to actually factor in the cost of carbon, because that will drive us to look at our manufacturing footprints in a very, very different way. And that will drive us towards these more distributed forms of manufacturing, but equally these more localized forms of manufacturing that will take us away from just that forward-facing view of manufacturing and the types of jobs that support that, to actually more novel business models that better support the circular economy and perhaps create a broader range of diverse jobs that look at manufacture, but also some of those other things such as repair, refurbishment, and so on and so forth. But potentially this will require not just firms to look at their supply chains in different ways, but perhaps also governments.
Thanks, Jan. As we emerge from the pandemic and so on, Bruce, you and I spoke about some of the real great lessons that have been learned, over the last 12 months and that were reflected in the latest Human Capital Trends report. Perhaps you could share for our listeners some of those most relevant lessons learned for manufacturers in terms of the future of work.
Well, thanks, Nick, and I'd be delighted to do that because in our survey this year, we specifically questioned, what manufacturers had learned from the experience of the pandemic and the pivoting often of their organizations, both in terms of what they produced, but also how they produced it. And we found a number of very interesting lessons, which I think exhibit an enormous potential for greater value from the workforce as we move forward into the post-pandemic world. And I'll just break those down. So the first is around designing work for well-being, where workers feel that they're at their very best. And that means for organizations, they're going to be their most productive. So we found that 40% of executives believe that personal choice is critical in determining where work is done. 39% of executives were looking at enhanced digital collaboration, whether that's on the assembly line or in the office, to improve productivity and allow a more distributed location where work is done. And 32% were looking at new scheduling norms, whether that's in the factory or again in the wider workplace. But most importantly, one of the lessons of the pandemic across industries has been the importance of well-being at work. And we talk about work, workforce, and workplace. And this is about architecting the well-being of employees and therefore their future productivity into the centre of the work that is being done. The second lesson we learned was around unleashing workforce potential through beyond reskilling. And that's about investing in skills that bring long-term resilience so that in future pandemics and future crises, the workplace and the workforce can be resistant and resilient to any change. So 74% of those organizations we surveyed said that reskilling of their workforce to exploit new technology is either important or very important for their success over the next 12 months. But critically, only 10% of them felt that they were in place to properly exploit that. And some of the things we looked at here were moving from building skills to cultivating capabilities within teams, moving from developing skills to leveraging the passion that many workforces had unleashed as they pivoted to new productivity and also new products within the pandemic, moving from just training to supporting learning in the flow of work, so improving the way in which work is done. A change in the way reward is given to workforces from a focus on output to a focus on gaining new capability. And finally, we move from an internal focus to preparing the workforce with an eye for benefits to wider society. So embedding purpose as central to the workforce and the work done by the organisation. We talked earlier on about the Superteam and how it becomes a critical workforce strategy. And a very concrete example of that which brings in lots of well-known manufacturers in the UK, is the ventilator challenge, which happened early last year, where on the 16th of March, the Prime Minister issued a challenge out to industry to meet expected demand for ventilators. And a pan-industry super team of Ford, Airbus, McLaren, Pendlon, and with some support from Deloitte, moved to scale up ventilator production, which was deemed to be critical to the NHS, from 50 a month to over 11,000, almost 12,000 in fact, in 3 months. And one of the critical learnings in terms of the work being done and the workforce and the workplace, there were 3 principal lessons. Firstly, a focus on innovation. So by way of example, through digital technology, they achieved a 60% reduction in errors. The second thing was a distributed workforce, both virtually and on site across the UK, whether they're in support in direct manufacturing. And thirdly, that when the ventilator challenge moved from beyond supplying ventilators to the NHS to more international production, the workforce within the super team were able to pivot to supporting that new product from a variety of manufacturers to deliver the output to their customers abroad. And so what that very clearly demonstrates is an ability to be both productive, innovative, and use the resources of the workforce in the most productive way to deliver value to the organization. And we think that super team example encapsulates the potential of the future of work.
Thanks, Bruce. And I think some really insightful lessons learned there from Global Human Capital Trends report, looking back over the last 12 months or so through the pandemic. Just to conclude, I think it'd be great just to perhaps have one piece of advice from each of you, Jan and Bruce, around what you would offer for manufacturing leaders as they plan for their workforce of the future. So perhaps, Bruce, what would be your one piece of advice for a manufacturing leader as they look to the future?
My advice is to move from survive to thrive post-lockdown. You need to look carefully at what innovations you took into your organization as part of the response to COVID and embed them as part of your future of work moving forward, whether that's speed of delivery, adaptability of your workforce in the face of new challenges, or the embrace of new technology as part of a super team. Survive to thrive is the advice.
Thank you, Bruce. Very good advice indeed. And yourself, Jan?
So in a similar vein, I think what we need to look, as we coin the popular phrase about building back better, is that competitiveness and productivity go hand in hand with actually delivering sustainability. And perhaps what we can use is that sustainability driver, or the need to build back better, as a way to fundamentally look at how you redesign or think about how your business is going to compete going forward. And fundamental to that will be the way in which you consider your approach to manufacturing and your supply chain.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both, Bruce and Jan, for joining me today. I guess what I would take away is just the huge importance and significance of the future of work, both for the long-term health of manufacturing as a sector, but also for competitiveness of manufacturers as we come out of this COVID-19 pandemic. That brings us to the end. Thank you, Jan and Bruce, for being my guests today, and thank you to our listeners. Please do take a moment to share a review and any feedback on this Industry 4 Ready podcast. If you'd like to have a closer read of the Global Human Capital Trends report, please visit our website at deloitte.co.uk. I look forward to sharing and discussing more on Industry 4 topics on our next podcast. Thank you and have a great day.